So this reading was weird, huh?
Yep.
Yeah.
To say the least.
Yeah, odd.
You just wanted to talk about incest. Now I'm getting it. Now I'm understanding.
Yeah. I had to listen to a lot of extra Judith Butler lectures and just a lot of supplementary material.
I also listened to some lectures, although I realized I think we've been misgendering her. Or them, I should say. I just did it again.
Yeah.
I must self-flagellate.
Well, the funny thing is I haven't heard Judith Butler address it. I've seen some people say them and some people say she. I don't know.
I feel like I saw it on their Wikipedia page. But I don't know.
Wikipedia
anyway.
Is not really.
Yeah, that's true. Anyway.
Authoritative source on people.
Yeah. I also was looking up lectures, although even the ones I saw, they didn't really go into it, into the stuff like that we were talking about in this lecture. Yeah, so we're continuing Judith Butler, right?
Yes.
And we're continuing with their book, Gender Trouble, and we're going to do chapter 2. You're going to drink Canada Dry, even though we're not sponsored by them. And also, I'll just say it. I'll start just saying this a few times in the beginning, but if you want to email us with why you hate us, why you like what we're doing, or whatever, if you want to just email and say, hey, email us at plausibleDeniabilityAMX@gmail.com.
Right.
I started putting it in the description of the episodes.
Right.
There we go. Okay, that's the little spiel. Now,
what did you think about the Reddit interactions last week?
Oh, I thought most of them were decent. Although I didn't read all of them, so you can say more about that. But yeah, you basically. Well,
I framed it in a little bit of a pushing way. So I said, is post-structuralism a reframing of Marxism? And it was a little bit sloppy, and it was a little bit intentional to try and provoke responses, to be fair. But maybe more specifically, I would say, is Judith Butler using or through post-structuralist feminist theory pushing a Marxian politic using the tools of post-structuralism, specifically Foucault and Derrida?
Yeah.
That would be a much more specific and much less enticing title.
Sure. Yeah.
And a lot of resounding, like, no, of course not. She's anti-Marxian, all that kind of stuff, which is absurd to me.
Yeah, no, they definitely don't seem like they're anti-Marxian.
I understand some of the distinctions that are being drawn, and I agree with some of the distinctions. I don't think that Judith Butler is literally Marx or Hegel or whatever, but to me, the project is about the same.
There was one interesting comment that I thought was good. I don't know if you saw it because you didn't respond to it, but it was, I think it was on the, it might have been on the queer theory subreddit. And it was, basically somebody was saying like, well, given Marx wrote 50 books, it's like he wrote about a lot of stuff, so everything's kind of a reworking of Marxism from that perspective. He even wrote a thing on mathematics.
Sure.
But no, I mean, I still agree. And I mean,
when I say Marx, I'm sorry, I shouldn't interrupt.
No, it's okay. I mean, one of the more prickly interactions you had was, you were getting a lot of pushback of like, because Marxism is strictly about class, and once you step away from talking about class, then it's no longer Marxist.
Right.
And then they're also like accusing you of not understanding what the end goal of Marxism is and stuff. And so that's where I at least felt like I wanted to chime in and say, it's like, they're using reification all over the place, which is a Marxist concept. So, and then also I listened to one of their lectures and it was very much like, it sounded like Marcuse, right? Speaking about, basically consolidating the factions of, I guess, black and brown people and women and the oppressed and everything like this to overthrow capitalism, and specifically talking about capitalism.
Right.
And then they were saying, they want socialist. Butler was saying they want a socialist, economy. But, obviously Marxism is I would say a form of socialism, right?
Right.
So, yeah, and then just all the rhetoric that they were using about that, just, So, and then you also had a few articles where Butler was talking about their Marxist, underpinnings, right? I mean, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Right. So there's an interview. I think the best one was an interview that Judith Butler gave, discussing.
And we'll get to the incest stuff. Don't worry, to our listeners, because that's what this whole chapter was about.
Right. Discussing how Marx was an influence on her work, and how she still teaches Marxist courses, or not Marxist courses on Marx and Marxist philosophy, and then going into how Marxist philosophy is important in the history of all sorts of things that she names as specific sort of academic genres or categories. They're very specific, which is kind of funny. But things like feminist socialism and queer Marxism and queer socialism and all sorts of sort of subsets of these critical gender and feminist theories that are sort of inherently Marxist. And then Judith Butler also goes into disputes that modern Marxists have with her work, but how Judith Butler thinks that ultimately they aren't disputes worth having, that they have the same project.
Right. And and that was another thing that Butler was emphasizing in this talk I saw too, of how exactly there might be a lot of differences in all these constituents that make up this front, I guess, progressive front, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, it's like the underlying thing is about getting rid of this patriarchal sort of white male, I guess. Right. The white male. And so that's where
I think it's capitalist, white male, it's whatever. It's that. Yeah. It's I don't know. But I think that the argument that Marx is only dealing with class, and if it's outside of class it's not Marx, is absurd. Marx himself, when we read the Communist Manifesto, said that it's about dismantling all social structures. He gives the example of the family, age, religion, outside of just simply class. So I think that's like they read Wikipedia or something and they're like stuck in that idea. I think that's very silly.
Well, and that's why I also thought, like, if you had been saying, like, Marxian analysis, maybe you wouldn't have gotten as much pushback, too, because that's the idea of, like, it's like Marx was using the techniques of Hegel and whatnot, and then you had that article where, or did I find that article? I mean, obviously, the post-structuralists have an issue with Hegelian dialectic, but I found an article where Butler was talking about sort of the benefit to using the Hegelian dialectic sometimes.
I also think that what she's doing a lot of times is kind of Hegelian. Yes. And I think that it's this thing where
you can't get away from Hegel.
Right. But this is the other thing, is Marxist is a word. That is a word that people use. And so to say, no, it's not Marx, it's Hegel, is like, are you pretending that Marx contributed nothing to thought? Is Marx, did he copy Hegel word for word? Is there any distinction?
I think he did.
Right, he just crossed out Hegel. Marx.
Well, it's funny. He was a young Hegelian. There was like a group of them. They were called the Young Hegelians.
I get it. He's into Hegel, but it's like, I don't know. Then why do we say Marxist? We should eradicate that word and just say Hegel.
Antushka, he loves them.
Oh my
Some
God.
called it a natural love.
Yeah.
Not me, though.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's... I don't know. Yeah, you really waded into it, though. It was again, I applaud you for being able to deal with the number of keyboard warriors that you have to go up against. Yeah, and then they just come in with just like what was one person was like, this is one reason why even if you can start a podcast, you shouldn't.
Right. I mean, they could be right about that. But.
Well, they could be right about that. That's very true. So, any other interesting points about the Reddit stuff?
No, I thought the funniest was the person who said, "Don't listen to this person."
I was confused by that. They were saying, "Don't listen to you."
Yeah.
Okay. Because it almost seemed like they were saying,
"Don't listen to it."
I thought it almost seemed like they were saying, "Don't listen to Judith Butler."
Oh, maybe. I don't know.
Because and then what did you say? You said, "Yes, I agree."
Yeah, I said definitely don't, or something.
Yeah. That's pretty funny.
Okay, so chapter 2.
Yes, chapter 2. The incest taboo.
Yeah, I tried to come up with a summary, but it's too complicated. I don't have a good summary. I have a really long string of stuff.
Well, I think if I had to summarize it as briefly as possible, it would be essentially Butler seems to keep coming back to the idea that because, again, language comes after, in the case of Lacan, who was a psychoanalyst that they spent a lot of the chapter sort of breaking down, because a lot of these ideas of a bisexual sort of sexuality come after language. You almost can't understand the natural or whatever right. People say, the presupposition, because you're trying to understand it with language, which is inherently structured by society. So anytime you do that, you're falling into the trap of being influenced by the cultural norms of your society. And so this was used to basically, they went through and they started with, I think, Levi Strauss, and then they went to Lacan, who was a psychoanalyst, and then they talked about Freud and finished with Rubin. And in all of these times, they were building up basically a dual sexuality. And then Butler kept coming back to saying, but this is socially constructed or culturally constructed. Right. And because you're using your language to describe it. And also in the case of like Strauss and Lacan and Freud to an extent too, they're also phalangocentric, right? Sure. I just had to throw that in there.
Yeah.
They're patriarchal. It's like Levi Strauss it's all about, or Lacan, it's all about like the central sort of, I guess, sex is centered on the phallus. Right. And so it's like being the phallus versus having the phallus.
Yep.
And what was it again? It's like, because this is also the issue, because it was a longer chapter. I had to read this over a few days, so the beginning parts are a little bit more fuzzy, but it was that the women end up being the phallus and the men have the phallus. Is that what it was? Okay. Yes. Yeah. Be the phallus.
Right. Men possess the phallus, and women are the phallus due to their lack of possession of the phallus, because they're defined outside of the phallus and having lack the phallus, which imbues them with power, which is phallic. Therefore, they are the phallus. It makes perfect sense.
So, to Butler's credit, part of the reason I think that this was such a confusing chapter is because the theories they were trying to summarize are just really confusing.
Right.
I mean, Lacan. I mean, that's Lacan's theory. That's not Butler, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, but it's also Hegel, because she talks about Hegel and how it's impossible to understand the masculine in-group without a feminine out-group occupying a non-space space.
Yeah. Well,
And that's how women are the phallus, because they occupy
Right.
a non-space space. Right. Again, it's perfectly obvious.
Well, and that's another thing I would say to summarize the chapter that it was full of, is it was full of like things possessing things in the negation of other things.
Yep.
So you're right, it's very Hegelian, because
Right.
that's the whole idea of, you know, Freud was building up binary sexuality based off of the incest taboo, and also was Levi Strauss.
Right.
And it was all based off of this idea that, you know, you end up wanting the opposite sex parent, but you can't have it, and then you like sublimate this, and you form an identity based off of that or something. I don't know.
Right, or so.
But it was, again, it's like forming from the negation of it, the denial of it or whatever. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I was actually thinking it would be kind of interesting maybe sometime to read the Freud ego and id stuff. Yeah.
So a few big points I took away from it. One is Butler's description of the law.
Yes.
And the law, as I understand it, is a reference to Kafka. But I'm not entirely sure what she means. I don't even really understand what the law means outside of language or linguistic construction. So as I read it, I get the sense that
that's the point,
law
I think.
and law and language are the law,
Yes.
and language or discourse or discursive history or something like that are sort of the same thing.
I think that's kind of, well, I don't know about being sort of the same thing, but I think the fact that you can't tease out which comes before which is kind of the point.
Right, but what is it? Because
what is
she's
the law?
not talking about, you know, like the legal code of Springfield, Missouri.
Well, no, like in the case of law, I think one of them was like, because this was another, and this is Rubin. I think Butler ended talking about this feminist Rubin who published an article in like the 70s about how the incest taboo, and this is basically building off of Freud, I think, the incest taboo is what starts what builds the sexualities, just like what Freud was saying, the bisexualities. And by bi, I mean, and that was all they're also confusing. Here I'm talking about the fact that there's two sexualities, right? Or sexes, rather, male and female. And that's built from the foundation of the incest taboo, because that's the first prohibition of a sex.
Sure.
And I think so in terms of law, I think they're talking about like that kind of thing, and I think that's what Butler's point is. It's like you can't really distinguish if this is actually the cause, or if the law, or if it's the cause of the culture. I guess, because it's like which came first. I guess was it the culture or was it the law? And by culture, I'm talking about language. Language is within that.
Right.
And so I think that's central to Butler's point throughout this whole thing, is because like Lacan and Rubin and Freud, in a sense, were trying to build these theories based off of law like the incest taboo. But Butler is, in my opinion, I'm interpreting it as if Butler's saying, well, we can't actually know what comes first, because you can't ever know what comes before language, because your language is your brain. You can't look outside of it. Which I actually very much understand that point. I think that's actually something I agree with her to an extent about,
Right.
Yeah. Anyway, I don't know. Is that how you interpreted it?
Yeah, I think basically. I think So there was a point I wrote down about the law.
The law.
Exactly.
I'm the dog.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm pretty sure the law comes from the dog.
Right. All right. So there is neither a subject that precedes the law, nor is there a subject that stands in front of the law, prepared to take it on. Subjects are always determined by the law, and only confined within that realm of possibility. So this is where I'm starting to conflate the law with language, because it feels to me like Butler and all of these people are essentially arguing that language is the determining factor of sort of reality, whatever that means.
So we're sure that, we're sure that that's something Butler believes, or not something that Butler's like, because that's, you got to be careful with this, is because they did a lot of.
This isn't a quote from Butler. This is on a lecture about Butler and gender trouble from another postmodernist professor. So I don't know. Maybe that person's wrong. I don't know. But this was describing.
What professor? I don't know. Just to understand. I
don't remember. I'd have to look it up, and then I have to open up a browser.
Okay. Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah. Anyway. Right. But that is also my understanding of what Butler is saying here, which is why it's so confusing to me, because the law precedes everything.
No, that's what I think Butler is trying to say.
And so subjects come into being by virtue of the law.
My understanding is Butler is saying you can't know if the law precedes everything.
Sure.
You can't know where does the law start and where does culture, which comes first.
Right, because any description of anything prior to the law is within the rule of the law.
That's my understanding.
Right.
But I could be wrong.
So then saying that there is anything prior to the law is essentially nonsense. Or
it's a narrative.
Which means that it's within the law.
Yeah. Here, here's one part I think that this is on page. Oh no, that's sorry.
It's like you found something you weren't supposed to talk about.
No, it was yeah, okay. I think this is the part. Where to start though? I almost feel like I need to just read the whole paragraph.
Yeah.
Okay, Rubin's essay remains committed to a distinction between sex and gender, which assumes the discrete and prior ontological reality of a sex, which is done over the name of the law. That is, transformed subsequently into, quote, gender. This narrative of gender acquisition requires a certain temporal ordering of events, which assumes that the narrator is in some position to, quote, know both what is before and after the law. Mm-hmm. And yet the narration takes place within a language which, strictly speaking, is after the law.
Right.
The consequence of the law, and so proceeds from a belated and retrospective point of view. If this language is structured by the law, and the law is exemplified, indeed enacted in the language, then the description, the narration, not only cannot know what is outside itself, that is prior to the law, but its description of that, quote, before will always be in the service of the, quote, after. In other words, not only does the narration claim access to a, quote, before, from which it is definitionally, by virtue of its linguisticality, precluded, but the description of the, quote, before takes place within the terms of the after, and hence becomes an attenuation of the law itself into the sight of its absence.
Right. Sure.
So that's where I feel like they're essentially saying you can't know. Because anytime you try to describe it,
right,
you're doing it in terms of the after. Anytime you try to describe the before, you're doing it in terms of the after. The after being, I
feel like it's more than you can't know. I think it's more radical than that. I think it's that there's no way to. I mean, you can't even reasonably suggest that there is such a thing as before the law.
Well, you can. It's just it'll always be in the terms of the after.
Right, so it's not reasonable. I'm saying you can't reasonably suggest it. You can say it, but you're stuck in the law the whole time.
Right.
Whatever the law is. I don't understand what the law is.
Well, again, the
Like
law
God?
is, I think...
I don't, like,
well, no, the law is whatever I think the culture is prohibiting.
right.
So it's like, because they go on to talk about the incest taboo is the juridical law that is said both to prohibit incestuous desires and to construct certain gendered subjectivities through the mechanism of compulsory identification.
Right.
But what is to guarantee the universality or necessity of this law? And then, but that, like, that's my point.
So just some structure of differentiation or prohibition.
Yes. But again, not all laws are universal, right, and stuff like that. I mean, Levi Strauss tries to say that the incest taboo is a universal law, but Butler doesn't really talk about the cultures where it isn't, but I assume that there must be cultures where it isn't.
So then I start. So if it's just if the law is sort of prohibitive structures, societal structures, prohibitive cultural structures, like an incest taboo feels to me like some kind of cultural structure. Mm-hmm. It doesn't feel to me reasonable to suggest that is primary to everything, because to me, I don't know if language is primary to taboos. So I get stuck on the language thing a little bit about sort of language creating all of reality. It seems to me, we've talked about this, different levels of consciousness have access to different levels of language and communication, but that doesn't mean, from my perspective, that reality doesn't exist. It feels to me like language is a tool of accessing reality and perhaps harnessing consciousness.
Well, now we have to read
and
Wittgenstein.
Expanding consciousness, sure. And that could very well be true. But I can also imagine pre-linguistic, like humanoid tribes. Maybe they had taboos, maybe they didn't. They probably had some kind of cultural structure. I mean, wolves have some kind of cultural structure, and they don't have language in the way that we have language. Yeah.
But they have a communication ability of some kind.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so you can take it all the way down, and like rocks have no cultural structure and no communication ability as far as we know.
Which is why I always bring it back to consciousness, and why I think that this is ultimately a question of consciousness. But anyway, I won't get into it yet. But yeah, I mean, this is, I think, Wittgenstein was based. I almost said Wolfenstein, by the way, when I was talking.
Nice. That was
Did
fun.
you ever play that?
Yeah, I did.
I actually didn't. Yeah, before my time. Did you play?
I like
Diablo
how you called it
2?
Wolfenstein too. That's funny.
I said Stein.
Just now you said Steen.
I did. Yeah. My God.
It's like young Frankenstein.
I thought I said Wolfenstein or Stein.
You just did.
Did you play Diablo 2?
Yeah.
Yeah, I tried playing Diablo 2. I couldn't get into it, actually. I was a World of Warcraft man myself.
I never played World of Warcraft.
Yeah.
I played Warcraft and Warcraft 2.
I played Warcraft 3.
Oh.
And RuneScape.
Oh, I've played Warcraft 3 also, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, good.
Yeah.
No, but Wittgenstein, I think, basically talks about this idea. And then also, why am I blanking on his name? Being in Time guy, starts with an H. It's not Hofstadter. It's not Hammeroff. We've got too many of these H names now in my head. God. Heidegger, Jesus. Okay.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. But those are two books that are two sort of philosophers who were really influential on thinkers of the 20th century. I would not be surprised if Butler read both of them. I think Butler even made a Heidegger reference, because I think that gets at exactly what you're kind of talking about. Is whenever we try to deconstruct all of these things like gender and everything, you ultimately have to approach it linguistically. And then also, I think when you talk about consciousness, you have to, in some sense, approach it linguistically, which is why I think, honestly, Chomsky has been able to insert himself into so many domains, because he has a psycholinguistics professor, which is what his bread and butter is. Right. It really does have so many applications. But yeah, I even heard Butler talk about language. I started listening to a lecture where they were talking about language and how translation, this is like a Derrida point, but translation is super important for talking about these things. I don't know. But yeah, I'm just kind of rambling now, just to say that I think you're right. I think that lays at the foundation of all this. And then taking it to sort of the consciousness stuff that I think about. I mean, I've talked about how I think language sort of amplifies consciousness, or it's like it allows you to bootstrap it and increase it. Right. And which is why I think, in any population that wants to decrease the consciousness of their constituents, they should basically employ methods to get them to become less literate. Because they'll be less reflective and they won't have as much memory and everything like that. Right. So, and again, I think it's just like all of these questions, kind of your ad absurdum point about like The Rock doesn't have law. That's exactly it, though. Is it's like none of these things come into being for somebody that's not conscious. I mean, I'm just thinking about animals, and yeah, I mean, there's plenty of examples of incestuous animals, right, and animals that are homosexual, heterosexual, right, right. All of these patterns, and then you could also think of where did we all come from? We came from the unicellular organism, and that was a organism that reproduced from binary fission. So it's like there was not even a need for somebody else to reproduce. So, but this single cell organism presumably isn't thinking about what it is to be that. Right. And so it doesn't have these existential questions about identity. So, yeah, I don't know. So I do think basically when Butler come to this point that you can't know what comes first, like the law or culture, or that they're essentially intertwined, and it is the same sort of predicament that we ran into when we were talking about consciousness, of how it's like, how can you explain this system of consciousness while being within the system? It's like, how can you explain law while being in the culture, while being in the system of the law and having the law already affecting you? Yeah, anyway, okay.
I think it's a weird question. I think...
You think so?
Yeah, I think that if the speed limit is 65 and you are subject to that speed limit, you can still explain that speed limit.
Well, first off, it was in response to all of these people that were using the law to explain how did the sexes come about and how does gender come about. Right. That was, again, the incest taboo was being used by...
I understand. So I think that the reasoning throughout this is not amazing. I'm not like... I think that, that at its root... The claim that you can't tell what came first, language or law or something like that, sure. I mean, you also can't tell what created the universe. You can't tell where consciousness sort of stems from and things like that. I agree that they're kind of boring philosophical questions because you can't investigate them properly. It's kind of like the question, what is art and what is music? I think that they're really boring questions because there's no answer. There's no right or wrong answer to that question. And so that's like that. I get it, and I think it's a fine point to remember, and I think it's, the doing a discursive history is interesting. You're talking about how has gender been defined and created in society, in what are the different conceptions that have cropped up to define gender, or gender identity, or sexuality, or all of these things, which Butler seems to sort of mishmash together and move seamlessly from one to the other. I think on purpose, suggesting that actually they aren't anything really. I think that the radical claim being at least suggested is that it isn't that gender is sort of subjective. It is that gender is not. It doesn't have any real meaning. It is a fiction. It's a cultural fiction. It isn't a subjective fiction. Even it doesn't come from within the person. It is a fiction crafted by the law of society.
Right, and it's performative.
And so the subjects perform gender, but the subjects don't invent gender out of themselves. Because the subjects can only exist within the law. The subjects do not create the law.
Right. Well, and I mean, this is potentially worth going back to, but I'm still a little bit confused about it, because, I mean, that gets me to the question of wasn't Butler saying that subjects don't exist, basically?
Yes.
Basically,
right.
Too. Mm-hmm. The subject-object idea.
Right. I mean, there's a few contradictions I've sort of made notes of here and there, but it seems like sometimes she goes back on herself, and I can't really tell, because sometimes it seems like the argument is that you can't tell whether homosexuality or heterosexuality is primary to the other, and sometimes it feels like the argument is actually homosexuality is primary.
Yeah. It's well, in all of these theories that Butler was laying out, in some ways it was making me wonder, are they just doing it is it actually this confusing, or are they just kind of building a straw person to make their argument easier? Because I was really confused even by the Freud stuff, and because again, a lot of what Freud was saying was the binary sexes developed from this incest taboo, and but it
the ideal ego, right? The superego,
right? But it didn't seem. I didn't really understand how hetero versus homosexuality come out of that.
So what I have for that, melancholy is created through the prohibitions of incest desires. And so by prohibiting incest desires, you set in a melancholy into the psyche because you're prohibiting something that somebody wants. This leads to the creation of the ideal ego driving the moral behavior of the ego. So then you have this superego that's saying, no, don't do that incest stuff. It's really bad. And so then melancholy becomes this perpetual system that's enforced by the superego. And so the ideal ego breeds further melancholy as it enforces taboos against the incest desires, driving heterosexual dispositions.
Well, yes, but it seems to me that it's just a question of whether you form the incest desire to the opposite sex or the same sex is what's going to ultimately...
But I think Butler was saying it doesn't matter. It works either way.
Butler was saying that, but Freud was saying it's supposed to go... I guess the idea is this is where maybe the culture or the law or whatever comes in to shape it too. Because that was my point, is it does seem like... I mean, this is essentially where I was trying to understand too, but of course they didn't really... Butler didn't talk about it, but it's actually making me think that Butler doesn't really believe in any predispositions of anything. Everything is sort of performative, right?
Right.
And so there's going to be no genetic underpinning to our desires. The desires are formed after the fact by whatever.
Yes.
I
think so. Yes. And I think that Butler is closest to Foucault. And in this section, Butler says, Foucault argues that the desire which is conceived as both original and repressed is the effect of the subjugating law itself.
So they don't believe in the born this way theory then?
No, not at all.
Yeah. Well, I wonder... but you know why I'm bringing this up? Because this is the thing I feel like a lot of people in, I guess, queer theory talk about, is this born this way idea that, you are what you are and you can't change it. But it does seem to mean that Butler is saying that these things are performative. So in theory, if you wanted to change it, you could.
I think that there's something that happens in the kind of vernacular space, like Twitter and YouTube and, like Charlie Kirk debates and stuff like that. and the born this way argument has a political function, because all of these arguments have political function. The entire purpose of critical theory is to develop intellectual structures to push the political movement. And so, like Marcuse, right? It's good to lie and spread disinformation in service of the political movement. And so, digging down, queer theory does not believe in born this way, but born this way is an incredibly useful narrative to get the general populace on the side of the movement. And so the intellectuals are not writing born this way. The people in the streets are chanting born this way to get, suburban moms and dads to have empathy for them.
Yeah. Well, and this was another sort of interesting...
That's a very unpopular opinion, but yeah.
Yeah, well... Yeah, I don't know. Because, again, in this talk, I can send it to you. It was intriguing. But it was, honestly, it was less intellectual, more of just kind of what's the word? They were on a pulpit, a stomping. What's the word? Anyway, it doesn't matter. They were stomping.
Okay.
But they were talking about the basically... Butler was addressing this backlash. I think it was from just a year or two ago that the speech happened. The backlash that's occurring against, I guess you could say, these policies of the left, and I guess we'd say the far left, of gender identitarian stuff, whatever, or maybe lack thereof. And they were talking about the incoherency of the right, and the right being emblemized by people like Putin, right? And Butler was talking about in 2015, Putin was talking about this is what gender is.
I think I heard this talk, yeah.
Oh, you did? Okay. Well, and I was just making me think, you're talking about incoherency. This book seems very incoherent. It's it seems like, oh, you froze for me.
Oh, yeah, okay. You froze for me too.
Is everything?
Yeah, it's all good.
Everything's good. Let me check my end. Yeah. But yeah, I was just if you want more people on your side, I think being clear with what your ideas are, because even after reading this, more than half of the book, I'm still a little bit confused on what exactly they believe gender is or isn't, or what sex is or isn't. I understand it's culturally constructed, but in terms of, and I guess the idea is that it's, again, it's
anything, right?
It's anything, right? But just being more overt about that, I think, would help because
but they need to make money, and who's going to give them money to write a book?
Well,
if they say gender is anything,
yeah. Well, that's the cynical point of view. I think it's more complicated than that. I wonder if part of it's because you see how Foucault wrote. It's there's this poetical aspect to it,
right?
But yeah, and then also just it seems like ultimately they're already also getting people. They're pretending like what they're doing isn't attacking people, but it is. It is trying to get at very foundational structures of
Right.
society, whether or not they are culturally constructed. To say that it is like an innocuous thing to suggest is, I think, a little bit
Right. I mean, yeah, Butler,
Wrong.
as Marx or Marcuse or any of them, would like to dismantle capitalist society for sure.
Right. But of course, they don't explicitly say, well, they kind of, I mean,
Yeah,
Butler
she
did
does.
in that talk.
In
But
the
yeah,
book,
I mean,
a little bit too.
Yeah. But I guess what I'm just saying is I almost feel like it would get people like me, whereas, and in some ways it feels like, well, am I even allowed to be on this team? Because in these talks also, it's always sort of framed as like we, the, either women or queer or black and brown. It's like, well, okay, you've already kind of put me, the white cisgendered
Well,
male,
right, because
into
you're really
the enemy.
entrenched. Yeah, you're really entrenched in the repressive law just by being who you are.
Right. And I mean, and yet here we are trying to read and understand this theory, I think from a point of view that is trying to be an ally, right? That's the word that's used. We can only be allies. We can't ever be part
Right.
of the group, I guess.
Well, I am not an ally, but yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to be an ally.
I'm nobody's ally.
You're an anarchist. Well, that's the other interesting point is it is I think Butler probably doesn't like many libertarians, and
Probably
yet
not.
a lot of this is the other thing is a lot of what they're purporting to do is kind of libertarian, of like, at least this is what they were saying in that speech, of how they don't want to necessarily get rid of the people that feel like they want to remain in the cisgendered normative way. They just want room to be who they are.
Right.
And that's, I think, a very libertarian standpoint. However, then they'll also throw in things like, nobody's freedom can exist without the freedom of others. And
it's the same as Ben Burgess and
Right.
and Thaddeus Russell. What happens if I don't submit to the system?
Right.
Because what happens if you don't submit to my system is nothing.
Well, your system, as I've said, I think in its logical end is the nomadic system. You would want us back on the plains,
I don't
which
want
is
anything.
fine. You don't want
I
anything.
think I want us on the plains.
You want us on the plains.
Yeah. In high rises on the plains.
Yeah,
I'm just kidding about that. That is the Ayn Rand thing about how she wants to see high rises at random places throughout the desert.
Really?
Yeah. Just like people free to, be as
Build
enterprising
wherever.
as they wish, anywhere they wish, kind
Yeah.
of thing. Yep.
Interesting.
I think that with this, there the reason it falls so flat for me is not the revolutionary part of it. That part's kind of exciting and interesting. Where it falls flat for me is the attempt at sound reasoning, where it just feels silly.
Yeah.
And even the Foucault stuff, maybe especially the Foucault stuff, where, here's a bit where Butler's talking about Foucault and it's just sort of the deeper point against Freud and Lacan and all these people. Thus, the repressive law effectively produces heterosexuality. So this is the law is prior to everything. It isn't even that there's heterosexuality and homosexuality, and then the law starts to make prohibitions one way or the other. It's that the repression itself creates heterosexuality and then acts not merely as a negative or exclusionary code, but as a sanction, and most pertinently as a law of discourse, distinguishing the speakable from the unspeakable, delimiting and constructing the domain of the unspeakable, the legitimate from the illegitimate. However, what I don't understand is you have X and Y, and you have a relationship to each other. And then there's arguments about what comes first, X or Y. And then you say that because people prefer X, Y is suppressed. Or because people prefer Y, X is suppressed. And then you say, no. The suppression comes first. And you have suppression of what I don't know, and then X emerges and Y emerges. To me, it's just a claim that could be true or not. It's like the last week when we were saying, homosexuality comes first or heterosexuality comes first. It feels like an easy claim to make because it may or may not be true. And I don't know if blanket oppression forms homosexuality or heterosexuality, and I don't even know how to test that.
Yeah,
it doesn't feel like a profound statement at all.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, and the idea that exactly what you're saying, any repression is going to form the opposite. I guess that's Hegel, though.
But it's not even that it forms the opposite. It forms the first thing, too.
Yeah. Well, this was my question. This was what I was kind of posing before with the Freud. Like, it seems like the incest taboo could just as easily create homosexuality as it could create heterosexuality.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a question I have too. Is why aren't these variables basically interchangeable throughout? Mm-hmm. Because that almost seems like what Butler is suggesting anyway.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, because I think that's ultimate. Obviously, Butler's not saying that we should be Well, okay, this is the other thing that was interesting because, again, in this speech that Butler was making, it was all about, how the right is portraying the left as like, they're coming after children, they're trying, and pedophilia and everything like that. But then here it does seem like Butler's basically saying that maybe like I don't know. Are they saying that we shouldn't have the incest taboo? You know what I mean? It's raising this point of essentially pointing in that direction, but not actually saying that, right?
Which is where it frustrates me, because Hoppe lays out what he wants the world to look like.
Right.
Butler will not say.
No, but that's my point, is to sort of claim like it's an innocuous movement that's, not really trying to harm anybody and not trying to sort of really like probe at these really fundamental structures is, I think, it's not true.
I think Butler would say it's trying to probe at fundamental structures.
No, you're right. But to frame it as an innocuous movement, and also to say that it's not actually getting at, like, to say, oh, this is just a caricature of the right. Like, reading this book, because that's another thing that Butler often says is, like, the people that are trying to, like, talk against all this stuff never actually read my books. It's like, so we're reading it, and I'm hearing from you that it seems like you think that we should be doing incest, or at least people should be free to do it, I suppose, if they want to, which maybe is how you feel, actually, Antushka.
No, I don't.
And here's, I think, again, it's like I look at it from a biological perspective of, even without thinking anthropologically, which I suppose is kind of biologically, it's like it makes sense if incest taboos are basically universal, maybe not completely universal, but pretty prominent, because we have noticed that they result in all sorts of genetic abnormalities. You're at an increased sort of predisposition of getting that. Something. When the closer people are to their relations, the more likely you'll get intellectual disabilities. You'll get all sorts of things. And I think even before you have an understanding of that, like many animals who don't have an understanding of that, still most animals aren't, doing incestuous things. Yes, you'll see the example of a hamster and another hamster, but, this is in very confined... I'm just saying, from my childhood, I remember the mother hamster doing some wild things, but this is in a very confined environment, right?
Nice.
This is in a confined environment that's not natural by any means, right?
So it's your fault.
Well, I mean, in the sense, if that's the only thing that they're around is people that are related to them, then yeah.
Prison,
exactly.
Weird stuff happens in prison.
Well, and it's I guess the point is it's a quote unnatural environment to be confined like that,
right?
So
Well, I guess Judith Butler would probably say, yes, you're correct, but zoom out. Because we're all in said prison. Said unnatural environment.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Well, but yes and maybe no. It's because we've also imprisoned ourselves. So, I mean, I've made this point before, and this is my point about the culture idea, is like maybe culture is natural, though. We've developed it supposedly by our own volition as a collective. So who's to say that that's not natural, that we came up with these things?
I agree. It's a point that I've thought for a long time, is that we are just as natural as anything else. And if an anthill is natural, maybe a road is also.
Yeah, yeah. We're part of nature as much as we try to, say we're not. Or are we Anunnaki hybrids?
Probably, yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Cool. So I think my friend's going to come on next week.
Okay. He's going to drop in, right?
Yeah.
So this next one's going to be tough because it's really long.
Yeah. I don't know if I'll get through it all because I've got a lot of other stuff.
Yeah.
But I was going to try to just start reading it like tomorrow and see if I could. But then I'll forget like the first half of it.
Right.
But that's okay. Very interesting.
Yeah, we didn't talk about
Butler.
masquerade. We didn't talk about pleasure located in the penis or vagina.
Well, you're free. The floor is open, Antushka. What do you want to say about it?
I don't know. I'm trying to think. Is there anything else important that? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of conclusions being drawn from questions that had strange if-thens that I didn't really understand where they were coming from. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think it's all approximately the same point, and it all feels extremely binary.
Yes.
Like, when I say extremely binary, I just mean everything Butler's talking about is this and that, and this against that.
Very Hegelian.
Right.
Well, and again, you could look at this whole movement of post-structuralism or whatever, post-structuralism, whatever Butler is, as a Hegelian counterbalance to the structural phalangocentric,
Yep.
And thesis. The antithesis. They are the antithesis whether they like it or not.
Right. And where's the synthesis? I guess that's kind of Foucault, right? The negation creates both. The entire binary is held together through the suppression or the repressive law.
Yeah.
There we go.
You got it. You figured it out.
I figured it out.
You can now level up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, man. So we got more of this. This took me a long time, too.
It took me a long time, too. Yeah. I've been reading it on the bus, too, so all my notes are, like, really, like, vibrate. It's like a 2-year-old's writing it, because, dude, the roads in Houston are just terrible.
Nice.
Well,
the title of the next chapter is pretty spicy.
What is it?
Subversive Bodily Acts.
Well, maybe it'll be exciting.
I think this is where Butler gets into why sex is also not biological. But I actually feel like at this point, that's been covered a lot.
Sort of. I'm still kind of confused by it. Like, it's been covered in the sense that they've said that it isn't.
Well, I think if we do this law language thing, it all functions because that works with anything.
Right. I think you're right. I think that's basically the idea.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess, yeah. I think that is the idea.
Yeah.
See? It could have been a 3-sentence book.
Right.
So my last question then about it is what do you think the value of this is? Because it's this weird thing that happens in universities, people with tenure. They don't actually have to create market value. Yeah. However, at the same time, they'll get raises and stuff based on bringing a lot of money into a university. And so, what is the value of a text like this? Who sees it as valuable and for what?
Well, yeah, I mean, I certainly... Well, do you want to go first? Because you asked this question a lot, and I think, yeah, why don't you go first?
I mean, in terms of a market value of the text, I think that that would be kind of it's kind of...
It doesn't have to be market value.
Well, that's what I mean. As opposed to like personal value, like it's personal sentiment.
Yeah, or again, well, okay, I don't know, just value.
So I think that probably the question is kind of offensive to Butler, or the movement and the body of work like this. However, I don't really think that people do things that aren't valuable, and so this is where I'm trying to see, why write this book? Who is it for?
Well, I think it's for people like Butler, who didn't feel like they saw their perspective in the annals,
right,
of sociology.
Adding something new to the body of literature on a topic.
Yeah, because I think that is the big benefit to the time we live in. There's a lot of issues, of course, but it is true that we have a lot of examples of the perspective, of the heteronorm perspective, if you will, right? Mm-hmm. And so it is good to sort of establish the entire domain of thought,
right?
Whether it seems kind of, just hard to understand.
Right. I mean, I'm not sure I buy the idea of the heteronormative or the queer perspective or anything. I think this is where, like, my radical individualism comes out. But I actually don't think a person can speak for a group like that.
Well, I don't mean to... I'm just using, I guess, these group terms because it's easier to communicate the idea of just, like, people like Butler, whatever that is, have not written on this kind of thing in the past, at least that we have access to, And so it's interesting just to see what this perspective is. I was thinking about this one thing where it's like, when you take off the guardrails, you're going to get... People are going to fill up every part of the intellectual domain, I think.
Right.
So it is useful in that sense. Again, if anything, it's just establishing a range of, like, this is where you end up if you basically break down everything, and then this is where you end up if you sort of try to, take the Hoppian approach and say, like, put your flag in the ground. And in some ways, you end up in contradictions in both settings, because we've talked about how, like, when Hoppe started talking about natural, what is natural, it's like he did it in a kind of very vague and incoherent way of, like, natural is, what natural is.
Right.
It's just what you know. And so having somebody like Butler, I think, it's helpful to be like, well, what you think is natural is already framed by the culture that you're in.
Right.
So,
but it's interesting that both the critique that they have on each other works, because I think that Hoppe's critique works because you can see it in Butler's writing, the sort of rationalizing yourself into madness.
Right.
Where it's not actually, it doesn't make sense. And trying to prove or disprove something that is, like, a priori true. Like, trying to prove or disprove that you can't tell what comes first, language or culture, it's like it's not really worth pursuing. And I think that's where you can see how it devolves in words and words and words and words, and you never really get anywhere.
Well, and this was the frustrating thing, again, about that speech that I saw Butler give, was it was a lot of talking about what the issues were, sort of, in vague terms, honestly. But there wasn't a lot of actionable items. And it's like, Hoppe, to his credit, at least had things like, this is the formula to this, and these are, like, if you want to have an anarcho-capitalist society, this is what you have to do.
He has a potentially testable hypothesis.
Right.
You can't test what Butler's saying at all.
It's hard to, because every time you sort of say that you're going to test something, then it gets broken down into, well, you know.
Right, it's not testable.
Yeah. But again, I think it's at least very... Yeah, I think just the value probably is the perspective, and again also getting me rather. I'm not, maybe not you, but having this hyper skeptical viewpoint, as Thaddeus Russell essentially has explained the postmodern view as, which I like that description, is a very, if used correctly, is a very good scientific perspective to have, because this is essentially what you have to do in science, even though I feel like you said, Butler's theories maybe you can't test them. But in science, you are supposed to try to strip down as much as you are able to what all the biases that could be going into the experiment are. And granted, whether that's possible. Right. I mean, I think this is the issue with a lot of sociology experiments, right? Is that how do you test things that are within the society when you come in with all of these, preconceived notions about things, right? Whomever you might be, right? Yeah. So the value is a few things. It's the perspective aspect. I think it is good to entertain radical skepticism, because. Yeah, I mean, again, even just with your theories about anarchy, it's always good to double check yourself. I think that's just a healthy thing. But, like Aristotle said, moderation.
Sure. Yeah.
So, if anything, just to establish the range and then to pull back between the Hoppian and the...
Right.
Butlerian.
Would you say Hoppe's the opposite of Butler?
No, but in terms of, maybe in some sense, because he is very much like, sex exists, identity exists, gender exists.
I feel like Popper or something is the opposite of Butler.
Maybe.
Like a 100% logical positivist or something like that.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I see what you mean. They're definitely on opposite ends.
They wouldn't get along. How about that?
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah. But I agree with you. I mean, it's true though. This is the good and bad thing about academia is you're insulated from reality essentially. I'm asking. I'm getting a sense or something that this has negative value. It's kind of like what you're talking about the opposite ends. Because to me, this is, we've talked about it before, Foucault is oblivion. This is the destruction of everything. Mm-hmm. But would you censor it?
No.
Good.
Wait, what, would I? No.
Well, when you start talking about negative value, then you can come into the point of like when people shouldn't read it. I don't think you were going down that road.
No, definitely not. Yeah. I think people should read it.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. I think that people should think and take on any idea that they wish to. Yeah.
Yep. We live in crazy times though. To your point then, yeah, I mean, it also is Butler a symptom of this? Or can we put of this idea, this post-structuralist stuff, or is she responsible in some sense for getting us to this point? I mean, I think...
Oh, I see.
I think probably somebody would have written a book like this if it hadn't been Butler, right? I don't subscribe...
I mean, she's not the only person who's written this stuff.
Yeah, but I don't know. I mean, you could tell, more about this than me, but this is one of the most popular books on... for like queer theory and stuff like that, right?
Well, I don't think so. If being pedantic, I don't think it's queer theory at all. I think there's a whole other field of queer theory. I think this is...
Or gender theory, I suppose.
Yeah, this is post-structuralist gender theory.
Yeah.
as opposed to gender studies, as opposed to queer studies, and they're all different. And a study is different than a theory. So I think there's lots of this stuff out there. Judith Butler is pretty well known in the world,
right.
I believe. But interestingly, I think that in terms of queer theory, Judith Butler's not super well liked.
Interesting. Why do you think that is?
I don't actually know. I think it has to do with being too focused on a masculine-feminine dichotomy. But we could look into some queer theory at some point.
Okay, that works. Sorry, my friend just actually texted me. Let me just read it.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. He said should be good. So he said should be good to join. He said he probably won't have time to read the section until this weekend. I'm going to just tell him maybe, let's see, how is this broken up?
I think it would be good to read the conclusion no matter what.
Yeah.
So maybe, like wherever we get to is cool, but make sure to get to the conclusion.
Okay. Where's the conclusion?
It's only 10 pages. It's on page 181. Okay. From parody to politics.
Oh, that's funny. That was actually going to be the part I was going to skip. Not even joking.
Oh, really? Wait, why?
Because, I was like, if I read up to the conclusion, I don't need it to be concluded for me.
Oh, I see. Okay, sure.
But I hear what you're saying. I'll tell him to read as much as he can, but at least to read the conclusion. Yeah.
Cool.
I think that's good. And then I'm going to try to get through it.
Yeah.
I've been able to, just to pat myself on the back, I've been able to get through every reading.
Yeah, you've done a very good job. It's impressive.
Thank you. Yes. Finally, somebody's impressed. I've been waiting for this for a year and a half, or whatever, year and some change.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. Sweet.
All right.
Bye.
See ya.